Welcome to the Kevin Bass Show long form podcast. If you have an idea that you take from this podcast that you want to apply to your own life, you should always talk to your doctor before doing so and never construe anything you hear as medical advice. And with that, enjoy the Kevin Bass Show. What's up, gang? This is Kevin. I'm going to talk to you about a post that I made a couple years back called Grains Are More Nutritious Than Meat. And I made this post because at the time I was knee deep in the plant-based community. I was a former low carber of almost 10 years, paleo low carb, strongly believed in those ideas. And I discovered by just playing around with some of the nutrient calculators that if you just loaded in whole wheat bagels and then you compared it side by side with just loading in ribeyes, 2,500 calories each, and that's all you ate all day, you'd have far fewer nutrient deficiencies with the bagels than you would with the ribeyes, which I found was extremely interesting because the belief system that I had always had was that meat is far more nutritious than wheat. Wheat is mostly nutrient poor. Grains are nutrient poor. Plant foods are nutrient poor. Meat is nutrient rich. This is the beliefs I had coming from the paleo community. Which are not at all accurate. But I didn't know that at the time, and these were still long-standing old beliefs that I had coming from that perspective. So I discovered this in Chronometer. I was part of the plant-based community, and then I wanted to troll the paleo low-carb people. That was the kind of game that I was playing back in those days. I will say that I still think most of this stuff is correct. I'm still, by the way, mostly a plant-based eater. I'm not at all a part of the plant-based community anymore because for the same reasons I can't be a part of the paleo and low-carb communities because there's just too many orthodoxies that are unrelated to science in the plant-based communities. And similarly, why I'm having troubles more and more now with the resistance training communities, powerlifting, bodybuilding, for the same kinds of reasons because there are strongly held beliefs that are not necessarily grounded in science. And that's probably the case for most online communities. Most online communities probably end up adopting very strongly certain central core beliefs that are not necessarily strongly based in science. And I think that's probably the case for most online communities. And they're very resistant to challenging or thinking about those because they're very central to the belief system. So I'm not a part of the plant-based community anymore. So I'm very detached from that now. And so I'm going to go talk to you guys about this post. I'm basically just going to read it and then I'm going to comment on it as I read through it. You know, kind of what I've been doing with a lot of these posts recently. I've just been going through a lot of my old content. And then as I do that, elaborating, giving new thoughts, commenting, etc. Because what I thought then isn't necessarily exactly what I think now, although I think it's 99% similar. I will say this, the most common criticism, apart from saying, were these wheat bagels fortified? They weren't fortified. That's the dumb criticism. It's not a good criticism. But there's a decent criticism that kind of makes sense, which is that the plant foods have what's called phytates, anti-nutrients that bind up minerals, etc. I don't think in normal human nutrition that these phytates are very particularly relevant for determining nutrient status. I don't think anybody's ever shown that. It's speculative that they could have an impact, but it's never been shown. There's also some data to suggest more mechanistic data similar to the data showing that there might be a harm. There's mechanistic data to suggest there might be a benefit to phytates by binding up some nutrients that are not necessarily good to have in high quantities. I don't know if I believe that either. I would say that we don't know much. And in the context of a Western nutrient-rich diet, especially an omnivorous one, these nutrient deficiency problems aren't much of a problem. There's no good evidence that it's much of a problem. And I think especially if you're eating whole foods, it's not going to be much of a problem. Especially if you're eating an omnivorous diet with meat, it's not as much of a problem. Now, if you're only eating wheat, maybe, but the differences between these two diets are so overwhelming, and phytates only bind a certain very small subset of nutrients that it really wouldn't matter anyway. right? It wouldn't matter for the purpose of my argument, even if the phytates did have a substantial effect. That said, there's one more caveat I want to mention before I dive deep in. The other caveat is with respect to the special nutrients in meat. So zoo nutrients, creatine, carnitine, carnosine, CoQ10, CLA, and there's many other nutrients that you can only find in meat that you're not going to find in plants. And I think those may have a substantial health impact. Also, the nutrient profiles in general may be important. So I don't think this is the be-all, end-all, and I don't think that a diet without meat is a good diet. I don't. I eat a little bit of meat every day as an ethical plant-based eater. I eat a little bit of meat every day myself because I don't feel right if I don't have some meat every day. I just don't. I've tried it. I've been vegan multiple times in my life. I just never felt good. So for that reason, I've always had some meat. I always eat some meat these days. So I think there are some useful things that are in meat that aren't necessarily in plants. And although I can't demonstrate that scientifically, I can demonstrate that scientifically, but I can't demonstrate that they're necessarily essential. I can only demonstrate that they have some health benefits. Not necessarily that they're absolutely necessary for human health, but they may be quite important. With all those caveats out of the way, let's talk about this post. So let's go bring it up. Grains are more nutritious than meat. So let's start. As a former paleo dieter, the idea is that grains are nutrient deficient, meat nutrient rich, and carbohydrates inherently harmful. These ideas were deeply ingrained in my habits of thinking, so much so that my first forays into eating whole grain bread after learning about plant-based diets were marked by an anxiety that lasted for years. Am I eating carbohydrates instead of fat for an ideological reason, at the expense of my health? Surely these plant-based writers who are talking about grains being healthy and grains being optimal, surely they can't be right. This has to be nonsense. That was a nagging thought. It wasn't an overwhelming thought, but it was definitely there. Nagging in the back of my mind. Well, certainly the plant-based writers are not right. As I understand now that they could not impartially analyze their way out of a wet paper bag. Still, those days of carb anxiety are long over. As I now understand carbohydrate and fatty acid metabolism to a sufficient degree as to now be inoculated from the paleo, keto, low carb, low fat, macronutrient fear-mongering. When I say I understand, I mean that I understand how little we know and how, when the popular nutrition writers inveigh against carbohydrates or fats in the diet, they are, to be generous, reading the scientific literature creatively. But what had lingered was the sense that because grains are nutrient deficient relative to meat, I needed to be especially careful to avoid the nutritional downsides of wheat bread, of which I ate copious quantities. Let's see, for example, the bloggings of the major paleo writers. Let's start with Chris Kresser. Quote, with this in mind, what are the most nutrient-dense foods? There are several studies that have attempted to answer this question. In the most comprehensive one, which I'll call the Malot study, researchers looked at 7 food groups and 25 subgroups characterizing the nutrient density of the foods based on the presence of 25 qualifying nutrients. Malot and colleagues found that the most nutrient-dense foods were, scored in parentheses, organ meats, shellfish, fatty fish, lean fish, vegetables, eggs, poultry, legumes, red meats, milk, fruits, nuts, in order. With the scores being quite variable, with organ meats having a score of 754, all the way down to nuts of 120. Legumes aren't doing much better, with a score of 156 compared to, again, the organ meat score of 754. Only vegetables come about halfway of what organ meats are at about 352. It's not going so well for the plant foods. Here's what Robb Wolf has to say. Grains are actually nutrient defunct, sick, compared to meat, nuts, and seeds and vegetables, at least when using Harvard researcher Matt Lalonde's nutrient density value chart. Okay, a few things. First off, it bothers me that he used the word defunct, because defunct means like obsolete. It doesn't mean deficient. I know Rob does a lot of like MMA type things, so it's possible that repeated head trauma may affect some of his writing, but it's not nutrient defunct, it's nutrient deficient. It's fine. And then he says, at least when Harvard researcher Matt Lalonde's nutrient density value chart, Matt Lalonde is like a technician at Harvard. He's not a Harvard researcher. So, yeah. So Matt Lalonde's nutrient density value chart puts organ meats and oils at 17 nutrient density value, and then grains all the way at negative 6.2. So it's like grains have a negative nutrient density value. Actually, fruits also have a negative value. Vegetables have a negative value. The only thing that doesn't have negative values are like animal foods. And then everything else is negative. Well, but in any case, I believe this stuff. And so surely whole grains have a well-justified bad reputation then, right? Well, it is worth noting that neither writer actually explains how nutrient density algorithms determine the rankings that they report. My guess is that, as with much what they write, they did not critically analyze the primary sources. And they just use these ready-made listings because they agree with their biases. This is my guess in any case, because when I actually looked at the raw data, I saw a different story, which was significantly more complex. This is purely accidental, just the result of playing with Chronometer. Yet what I found shocked me. For example, here's the nutrient profile for 2,500 calories of whole wheat bagels. You guys can see here, mostly it's green and red, which is red is like a lot, and then green is, a lot. And then you're missing vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin K, vitamin E, vitamin B12, some potassium as well. Okay, and you're missing some fatty acids, especially omega-3 and omega-6s. Interestingly, you're getting over 100 grams of protein, which is more than most people get, which is more than the average American eats of protein, which is funny. And that's 10 whole wheat bagels. 10 whole wheat bagels, 100 grams of protein, 2,500 calories. Now here's 2,500 calories of lean ribeye, the lean ribeye, not even fatty ribeye. Fatty ribeye is actually much more nutrient poor than this, but lean ribeye, the favorite cut of the so-called online carnivore subculture. Here we see more blank spaces, right? You see some, but you see more here for the ribeye, okay? An all-ribeye diet is severely deficient in 9 nutrients and moderately deficient in 4. An all-bagel diet is severely deficient in 6 nutrients, moderately deficient in 1. That's a difference of 3 plus 3 nutrients, 6 nutrients. 7 nutrient deficiency versus 13. 7 versus 13. In other words, if one could choose between only wheat or meat and one was aiming at nutrient adequacy, the answer is clearly wheat. Of course, choosing between eating only meat or only wheat would be insane, but the former is, as I said, just what one online subculture actually does. They actually only eat meat. I'm just reporting the facts. They actually literally only eat meat. Not a coincidence, Robb Wolf, mentioned above, actually helped to promote the growth of this subculture by platforming Sean Baker and many other carnivore diet enthusiasts to eat this all nutrient deficient all meat diet. What happens when one slightly diversifies the plant foods? So we look at half lentils, half wheat bagels. An all ribeye diet is deficient in 13 nutrients, severely in 9, moderately in 4. Half bagel, half lentil, deficient in only 6 nutrients, severely in 6. Okay, so one of those moderately So now we're a difference of 7 nutrient difference. It's a little bit better. What about reducing wheat and lentils to 43% of calories each? Putting almonds at 9% of calories. Making up the final calories, 5% of calories with broccoli and carrots, a handful of each, and sardines, a single sardine, 1.6% of calories. By the way, this is quite similar to what I eat. This is funny. I call it the poverty omnivore diet. And I actually wrote, I said, and it is very, very nearly my own diet. This actually is true. As an amateur athlete, I'm not an amateur athlete. I'm going to be a pro athlete. I add supplemental protein for optimal recovery and muscle mass and a lot of berries. That's the same diet I ate since 2019, at least. That's funny. And you look at this, it's perfection. It's perfection. And then just supplementing with vitamin D. Perfection. Everything's perfect. Right? Except maybe you'd want a few more omega-3 fatty acids, so you just take 2 sardines. You don't even need 1. You just have 2. And this is dietary perfection. And look, and it's only wheat, lentils. 43% of calories is from wheat. 43% is from lentils. 86% total calories together. Almonds at 9% of calories. That's like less than 10% of calories. And then final 5% is broccoli and carrots and a single sardine at 1.6% of calories. And you have dietary perfection. Mwah, mwah, chef's kiss. That's beautiful. High amounts of leucine. I'm actually looking at this again. Good amounts of methionine. Yeah, man, this is good. And 146 grams of protein. That's good for your muscle gains with a Z, G-A-N-Z. Add sunlight and you're meeting all of your vitamin, mineral, and protein needs in spades. For reference, and I wrote this down, you're going to get 450 grams of bagels, 930 grams of lentils. That's a lot. That's a little bit much. I can tell you, you have to really boil those really well. Make sure that they're very soft or you're going to struggle. 100 grams of broccoli, 100 grams of carrots, 40 grams of almonds, and 1/4 can of sardines. That might actually be 2 sardines. Again, for comparison, here's an all-ribeye diet. It's terrible. Look at this beautiful, what I call the poverty omnivore diet versus the ribeye diet. It's absolutely horrific. There's no comparison. The poverty omnivore diet destroys nutritionally the all-ribeye diet. To provide further contrast, it is easy to find claims by pseudoscience pushers online that animals are more nutrient dense than plants. And you see here in Raphael Sertoli, named after the famous immunoprivileged testicular cells. Or perhaps he's a descendant of such, although, as I understand, he wasn't able to complete his PhD. He says, true, but animals concentrate what's in plants. Ergo, generally, they have more nutrient density. Well, as we see, this is actually not true. It's just not true. It's totally just not true. This is not the truth. And I'm not here to promote the plant-based community. Again, I'm basically exiled and excommunicated from them. I don't have anything to do with the plant-based community anymore, and I don't ever want to. But I'm telling you what the facts are, and this is the facts about the nutrient adequacy and nutrient density. Now, you don't necessarily need to be concerned about the nutrient adequacy and nutrient density, right? But this is the claim that they were making, that meat is more nutrient dense and more nutrient adequate, and it's just not true. It's not true. Okay, a few points. First, it is sometimes claimed that meat nutrients are more bioavailable than plant nutrients. And we talked about this at the beginning. For a few minerals, this might be true, but I'm not aware of any evidence that this has any meaningful impact on nutrient sufficiency. If readers are aware of such evidence in an otherwise nutrient-rich diet, such as the one I've posted, please leave a comment or contact me. And nobody has. Not a single person, by the way, for over 3 years. Second, the idea that grain consumption led to worsened health at the beginning of agriculture has led to much speculation that grains per se are suboptimal foods. A paper that reviewed all of the literature on the subject, published in 2011, concluded that stature is certainly diminished in most, but not all, human populations during the transition to agriculture. Yet in its discussion, it focused on famine as the likely explanatory factor, not grain intake per se. And you guys can pause the video and read through this because it's a very interesting passage, but we're not going to talk about it here. Nonetheless, it's not grain consumption, but famine. And once people got hold of the famine issue, then the problem resolved. And it says, furthermore, if grain consumption in agriculture was the cause of reduced height, the average height would still not have increased dramatically over the past few centuries. The Western diet is still heavy in grains, but yet, despite the Western diet being very heavy in grains, we've got massive increases since the early 1800s to the early 2000s in height of average of men and of women, over, in many cases, over a full decimeter, right? In some cases, in the Netherlands, for example, almost 2 decimeters, almost 1/5 of a meter, 20% of a meter, you get an increase from 1810 to 2010 in the Netherlands. People in the Netherlands are tall, but they used to not be. Okay. All right. Finally, if grains replacing meat were the cause of reduced height during agriculture, then vegetarian children wouldn't be of similar height as omnivorous children. Yet vegetarian children are of similar height as omnivorous children, despite not having any meat. So why are paleo myths about meat being more nutrient dense than plants so widespread, despite the actual story being much more complicated, to say the least? My guess is that this is largely motivated by what we'd call modernity anxiety. For all of human history, humans have idealized and romanticized simpler ways of life, as exemplified by our hunter-gatherer ancestors. And we can go all the way back to early Chinese literature. You can go to the Tao Te Ching. To see that, you can go back to Hesiod in Greek literature. It's very clear there in Hesiod. I believe he talks about the Golden Age in his poems. So no matter the very origins of modern Western and Eastern culture have at their heart a modernity anxiety or a yearning for an unperturbed past. Oh, the same goes for Genesis, right? If you're thinking of the Garden of Adam and Eve, paradise, right? Lost paradise. Buddhism's the same way. Although for different reasons. And Stoicism, Stoic thought is very similar as well, for the same reasons that, very similar reasons as Buddhism. At the origins of the main strands of modern thought, both the East and the West, we have this modernity anxiety, which idealizes and romanticizes simpler ways of life exemplified by our hunter-gatherer ancestors or agrarian ancestors in some cases. Although even in the case of the Chinese literature, they were quite paleo. They didn't like grains either. We imagine our hunter-gatherer ancestors all ate large quantities of meat. It follows that we should eat meat. We therefore look for sciency-sounding reasons for this belief. Folks like Chris Kresser, Robb Wolf, and Mark Sisson all provide these sciency-sounding reasons because this is what we've already believed anyway. We're just looking for reasons to believe it. Instead of critically evaluating what these bloggers write, immediately we think, so that's why. We're already primed to believe, not to question. And so we believe. Or at least once upon a time, I did. But not anymore. The reality is that the role of plant foods in our ancestors' diets is substantially more complicated than these writers let on. For instance, and I have a tweet. In the past decade, archaeologists have applied new techniques to analyzing teeth of prehistoric humans, finding near universal presence of wild grain legume residues more than 100,000 years, ubiquitous presence of these foods during human evolutionary history. And the rabbit hole goes much deeper, but that is a subject for another post. And I've actually already talked about this in other videos. Suffice to say, every scientific field is more complicated and richer in controversy than we think at first. Often we first access a scientific field via a popular writer who tells us a good story and appeals to pre-existing beliefs to sell that story. Yet no matter if they are a New York Times bestseller or a famous columnist or respected by large popular audiences on the internet, we should always be skeptical of the new things we learn, especially if they resonate with and make sense of what we already believe. Especially if they resonate with what we already believe. We should especially be skeptical in those cases. Yet we often do the opposite. We often are less skeptical because we think, it resonates with what we already believe, therefore it must be true. But that's not what we should be doing. we should be immediately skeptical if something really makes sense immediately. Where are the holes in our thinking? Unless we are critically aware of and have critically assessed the relevant body of literature, there was no way to know whether we were being sold a good yarn or something with a strong basis in scientific fact. Until we know better, we need to proceed through life with the assumption that most of what we know is simply a best guess based upon something we heard that sounded credible, because that's all it really is. My journey through nutrition science, especially with respect to grains, carbohydrates, meat, etc., has taught me that over and over and over again. There's an update. Some people have pointed out that ribeyes should not have carbohydrates. I do not know why the entry at the USDA had ribeyes with carbohydrates. Therefore, I found a new ribeye entry. And here you see it here. Slightly better than the ribeye included originally. Still not as good as grains. And with that, it's a video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Please leave positive comments. Please leave positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Please leave Patreon money, because that's the way you can show love. That's the best way you can show love. That makes my day when I have a new Patreon subscriber. And I want to also thank everybody who has been a Patreon subscriber. I just recently looked at the Patreon subscribers who are around. You guys have been sticking with me, and I love you. I love the fact that you're sticking with me. That's amazing. And if more of you want to sign on, because you maybe have $5 a month or $20 a month, that would make a world of difference in my life. That would change my life. Like each $20 addition changes my life. It's a really big deal. And so I appreciate everybody who's done it. If people can continue doing it, that would be much appreciated. And I hope you can, because it really makes a difference in my quality of life. So with that, again, hope you guys enjoyed it. Peace. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please check me out on patreon.com at Kevin and Bass, where you can donate and make this podcast possible. Also check me out on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, where you can find my latest thoughts on the latest controversies and findings within health science. Also check me out at The Kevin Bass Show, both on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. I hope this podcast was useful to you. If it was, please leave me a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. See you guys in the next episode.